Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 22nd of February 2018, 11 minutes past 1. Very many apologies for the slight technical delay, but here we are. Well, Mike, we've got quite a busy news in the time left to us. I'll just say we're also going to be joined by Alex Thompson with Eastern Approaches. So where should we start? Housing, I think. And very, very interesting. Of course, we used to have a system in UK where people who couldn't afford to buy their own houses and maybe couldn't afford to rent could get a council house. And while some of those council houses were not the nicest houses, in general they provided a good family home. And the important thing was that families who took on a council house knew that they had a safe home for life, and in fact several generations would often live in those houses. Well, the government changed all that a few years ago by bringing in social housing associations, and of course this was done by creating quasi private companies with local authorities having a finger in the pie. But the headline here tells us the next stage, government set to privatise housing associations to wipe state debt and encourage building. So this is really a conjuring trick going on here, because what we've got are those public houses paid for by public money are now going to be handed over to the bankers, and it's all in the name of progress. But don't worry, because Theresa May has said that she's going to take personal charge of this housing crisis. So we're going to privatise social housing, and we're also going to be building more houses because we haven't got enough houses. Well, mainly because we don't know how many people they're going to be in the country, but not to worry, because Theresa is going to sort that out. Are you full of confidence there, Mike?
No.
No. Okay. Well, let's see what cunning plan she's going to use to sort things out. We're going to be moving away from treating associations as public bodies, and that'll enable them to borrow more money and build more homes. By reclassifying housing associations as private organisations, more than 60 billion of debt will be removed from the state balance sheet. And I've waved my magic wand, well, she didn't say that, and the debts of housing associations were private, but we've now reclassified them as public bodies in 2015, and that was done through the Office for National Statistics.
Right, so sorry, can I just understand this? What you're saying is that these quasi-public-private organisations, somewhere in the middle, not quite sure what they were, but their debt was considered to be private debt, and then in 2015 that was reclassified as public debt by the Office for National Statistics, yes. And now the government is going to fully privatise these so they can get this debt off the books?
Yes.
Why couldn't they just reclassify it in the way that it was done in 2015 then?
I don't know, Mike, and I hoped that you were going to give me some advice on how this system was working. What I think we're looking at is fraud and corruption with public money, but the minimum we've got is, of course, that housing, which was paid for out of the public purse, is now going to be handed over to some private company to manage.
Well, I mean, that can't be true, Brian, because later on we'll be talking about the corruption index, and we'll see later on whether what you've said is correct. So we can discuss it further later.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to defence. And Gavin Williamson was speaking to the Defence Select Committee yesterday. And aside from telling us all that Russia is a bigger threat to the United Kingdom than terrorism, once again pushing forward this nonsense rhetoric, he has announced a combat air strategy. This apparently is the Ministry of Defence working across government and closely with industry and international partners to explore the UK's future air combat capabilities and building on the industrial strategy and refreshed defence industrial policy, which was launched last year. So this all sounds very good. Gavin Williamson said, since the birth of air power, British industry has been crucial to maintaining our military's world-leading position. As we celebrate 100 years of the RAF protecting our skies, it's fitting that we create bold and ambitious plans to help our brave armed forces keep us safe in the face of intensifying threats. That's Russia, by the way. The Combat Air Strategy will bring together the best of British engineering, skill and design and deliver a compelling vision for the future of air power. But will it? Well, the details that they've given here are that the air sector of our defence industry accounts for 85% of Britain's defence export orders, 2,500 companies, £33.5 billion in turnover, 128,000 people employed, and 26,000 of those in highly skilled research, design and engineering jobs. But actually what seems to be going on is that they're building this procurement and industrial infrastructure that David Ellis has been talking about for some time, because just last week the Ministry of Defence announced or led the bid to replace Belgium's fighter jets with 34 Typhoons in what's being described as a comprehensive defence and industrial partnership between the governments of Belgium and the UK. And we're increasingly seeing this, Brian, aren't we, as EU military unification moves on apace. As David Ellis has been talking about for a couple of years now, we're seeing this merger of European defence companies. And this new air combat capabilities air strategy is really driving that forward.
Yes, but it's also remarkable, Mike, that we're getting excited about some partnership with Belgium, because with the greatest respect for people in Belgium, Belgium has not got a huge reputation as being a dynamic provider of defence equipment. So I think this is all hype spin, but it's another treaty locking us into another treaty. There's going to be more of these, which ultimately is going to help that process for EU military unification. Belgium defence, no, doesn't work for me.
So let's bring Alex into the programme. Welcome, Alex. And you've highlighted this. French business paper reports that at Munich, France, I presume this is the Munich Security Conference, France and Germany agreed to have a European military. NATO sets its terms for acceding to it, and that Macron as its big interventionist figure.
So there we are, and at the bottom of the slide there you can see that the sub-editor who tweeted this out, or rather that put the front page to the headline itself in Les Echos, said that France and Germany are à l'unisson face à l'Amérique, which is an unfortunate phrase. It's something like they are shoulder to shoulder facing or opposed to America, or at least as regards or facing America. It's not a very good sign. And at the same time, we've got the senior senator from South Carolina, Senator Lindsey Graham, or Graham as they say in America, who attended the Munich Security Conference and said, "I'm here representing John McCain, I'm his sidekick." He said, "I've had some kind of Damascus Road experience, and I now believe that European Union members," or he said European countries, not EU member states, that's the key thing, European countries should now be as unified in their defence as American states are. They're allowed to be proud of their history, but they should all club together. So the US deep state apparently wants that. And at the bottom of the slide there, we just had another mention of the Guardian. It's dressed up as a pig, but we see that told here by Mr. Krastev, a foreign-funded, apparently, commentator in Sofia, Bulgaria, saying, "Come on, it's time that the Western Balkans, which is the former Yugoslavia plus Albania, got on board with the EU," which is something you've been reporting, Mike, is something that the Mogherini, the head of European defence and foreign policy, has been saying now for some weeks.
Indeed. But the other question you want to get an answer to is why the sudden United States support for EU military unification?
And here we have a clue provided by Mr. Alex Gorka, who, by his writing record, is rather in favour of the Europeans going their own way from America in defence. And he's being a bit frank in this website that has a fairly good reputation, Strategic Culture Foundation. And he concludes his article with those two paragraphs I've put, which are the latter, well, it's one paragraph in the text, but if I read the second half out, which I've isolated there, he says, "With Great Britain becoming a leading member of this new European alliance," which is something that Theresa May asked for at the Munich Security Conference last week, "US interests will be well protected, while the existence of an independent European force will remain a pipe dream." So with his cynical hat on as an opponent or skeptic of US control of European military policy and crucially military funding and taxing, he's rather giving the game away here that Britain is going to be the interlocking piece, as with the Canadian-style free trade agreement, to make sure that America and Europe remain an economic entity, a supranational blob.
Alex, in the Guardian's coverage of the defence of the combat air strategy, this morning, they made the statement in their report that Theresa May is absolutely refusing to get involved in the new unified military structure. But as you have pointed out, and as I reported on Monday's programme, in her speech at the Munich Security Conference, she was saying exactly the opposite. So at what point do you think, is it going to happen that the mainstream media actually catches up with this agenda and starts reporting honestly about it? Or are they going to continue pumping out fake news on this subject?
Well, most of them pre-write their pieces, Mike, particularly the Guardian stuff, because the Guardian is, as we've seen in many areas now, a funnel for deep state thinking and lines to take. These pieces are pre-written. Deborah Haynes, the Times defense correspondent, who often gets snarled up with, well, she doesn't engage with him, but she talks to David. She gets retweeted by David Ellis with comments about how she's failed to understand things. Haynes is an exception because she does tweet live. And so we found out from her this week that she was actually surprised to find out that there was an emerging Five Eyes idea for, so all the Anglophone countries in the Intelligence Alliance were basically going to have the same frigate design or destroyer design. I think it is Type 26 from now on. So she kind of, with loose lips, gives the game away. She actually reports what Williamson is saying, almost with bated breath, But the rest of the press, particularly Guardian, does tend to pre-script the stuff. So it's almost as if Mrs. May is so boring and tedious to listen to that the press is banking on the fact that nobody will make it through listening to one of her speeches and just take it from the press that what she said was actually 180 degrees from what she did say.
Well, yes, I accept all that, but just to clarify, this is a statement that the Guardian made today about Gavin Williamson's statement in the Defence Committee yesterday. So that is 5 days or 4 days, 5 days following Theresa May's speech. And they're still denying that she's interested in this. So I'm fascinated by the fact that they continue to pump out this lie. It is a lie, isn't it?
They've got to do it, Mike. I think they've got to do it in order to cover their tracks on what's really happening, because the truth is getting closer and closer to the surface, and the only way they can keep a sort of skim over the top of it is propaganda. Well, have a look at this from the Telegraph. I picked up on this headline straight away because it was so weird. It says soldiers had their mobile phones taken from them to help pay for Britain's new nuclear submarines. So that was the headline. I thought, what's this about? You get into the article, it's saying, well, that they've got to make about 300 million savings in order to help fund the Trident programme, and that's being done by cuts of small items of equipment across the board. So the headline is spun to make it ridiculously emotive that they're going to get rid of mobile phones to help pay for our Trident nuclear capability. That is complete mind-bending nonsense by the Telegraph. But once you get into the article, you find that it isn't even about these minor cuts versus Trident. The key part of this story is this: basically MPs expressing concern at a company called Melrose Industries taking a hostile acquisition of aerospace giant GKN, planning for it to be broken up and sold to firms across the world. So that's the meat of this story. But what the Telegraph is trying to do is to sow discord between the three services. This is a common tactics by governments. It says to the Air Force, you can't have these planes because the money's going to be spent on the Navy, and then the Navy and the Air Force end up arguing amongst themselves rather than united in tackling the nonsense coming out of the government. But if you follow this through, here's Melrose, here's their executive chairman. He's had long-standing involvement in manufacturing industries and private investment, brings a wealth of experience to the board. Coopers and Lybrand, Wassell PLC. As you go through this company, it's all banking. This lady interested me because if you have a look at her, she was working as Group Director of Corporate Affairs for Smith & Nephew PLC, following a secondment to the Department for Business Innovation and Skills and Treasury, where Liz worked to establish the Enterprise Capital Fund. So 1 minute you're working for the British government, then you're drifting in, and now this company's attempting to buy up GKN. But have a look at this. Here's another headline from the Financial Times. Melrose reports full year loss as it continues pursuit of GKN. So I always say, when they say a full year's loss, if you were working as a sole trader, as a window cleaner, you'd be deemed bust. But this company, I'll put bust in inverted commas, but it's targeting GKN. And here's the chairman of Melrose, Christopher Miller, saying GKN would gain significantly by becoming part of an enlarged 10 billion UK industrial powerhouse, benefiting from the proven Melrose operating model.
Which makes a loss.
Well, which is making a loss. So this is dangerous, dangerous stuff. This is a bank-backed asset stripping company now pulling Britain's defence companies apart. Let's remind ourselves that Jeremy Corbyn was vowing to curb the City of London's powers. These are some of his comments from the Times article. Corbyn stepped up pressure on the government to prevent the takeover, warning that a valuable company would be sacrificed so a few can make a quick buck. That's a pretty true comment. Broadening the scope of the public interest test. He would broaden the scope of the public interest test, allowing government to intervene to prevent hostile takeovers which destroy our industrial base. So we'll give him a tick for that as well. And he's vowing to make finance the servants of industry, not the masters of us all, and insist that finance needs a fundamental rethink. So fascinating that the man who signed the early day motion on the Bradbury is saying the right things about big financial power, but he's not following it up by staying true to what he promised with that early day motion on the Bradbury. But what are we seeing here? We're seeing British industry stripped, and this is in line with this route through to EU military unification. That information came from the Financial Times there. And this is the one I think you're indicating. We shouldn't worry because all is well in UK.
Well, it absolutely is, because the Transparency International has published yesterday its Corruption Perceptions Index. I'm always amused. It's how corruption is perceived, not whether it's not the reality of it. But the UK has gained 1 point in Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. This is moderate progress. But they're concerned particularly about the lack of delivery on the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. They say a 1 point rise in score for the UK in Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index represents moderate progress in fighting corruption, although much more is needed on implementing promises that have been made if the UK is to lead on anti-corruption. So the UK now has a score of 82, and this moves it up to joint 8th in the global rankings. In 2015 and 2016, it scored 81 on both occasions, and it was scoring 74 in 2012. So we're going in the right direction. Brian, we see this fantastic lack of corruption on a daily basis, don't we?
No.
Alex, I don't even know where to start with this. What's your thoughts on the levels of corruption in Britain?
Well, there's a whole book on it, How Corrupt is Britain, by some mainstream academics, suggesting, in fact, in the blurb for the book and the reviews, that Britain may, in fact, be the most corrupt country in the world. And the same applies to the other Anglosphere countries and the Northern European countries. The corruption simply takes other forms, particularly dark spots on that map. As an alert man, Ergin Warrior 17 said in our chat room, dark spots include Venezuela, Libya, Sudan, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq. Has anyone noticed the connection between all these? Anglo-American sanctions.
Well, indeed, absolutely correct. Right, sorry. Let's move on then. Now, European Council has published some guidelines in the last couple of days regarding Brexit. These are the principles for the future relationship with the UK. This is an internal EU27 preparatory document. It was presented excuse me, it was presented, it says that these slides are for presentational and informational purposes only, and were presented at the Council Working Party on the 15th of February 2018, but they were just put up on the European Commission website yesterday. It says basically making the point that the preferred approach of Theresa May to what happens regarding trade following Brexit has been thrown out the window. This is their principles on screen for the future relationship. They say a third country cannot have the same rights and benefits as a member of the Union, as it does not live up to the same obligations. A balance of rights and obligations are required. They've got to preserve integrity and proper functioning of the single market. They've got to preserve the integrity of the single market. They say preserving the integrity of the single market excludes sector by sector participation. And this, of course, is a reference to Theresa May's desire to opt in to certain aspects of our relationship with the EU. Access to the single market requires acceptance of all four freedoms, including freedom of movement. And of course, that's one of the bones of contention. They want to avoid upsetting existing relations with third countries. They want to ensure a level playing field. They say should safeguard financial stability in the Union and respect its regulatory and supervisory regime and standards, and preserve Union decision-making autonomy and the role of the European Court of Justice. Now, they published this little graphic which shows the problems that the EU has, or the EU proposals have with various, the UK's proposals have with various EU countries. So, for example, Switzerland isn't happy with the situation that the UK doesn't want free movement, no substantial financial contribution, and regulatory autonomy, and so on. So everybody has problems, and what they're basically saying is that if they can negotiate their way out of all these problems, then perhaps Britain can get to a similar arrangement as Canada, for example, or perhaps it goes to a no deal, in which case the fallback position is World Trade Organization rules. But here's the crux of it. UK views on regulatory issues in the future relationship, including three basket approach, are not compatible with the principles of the European Council guidelines. For example, autonomy of EU decision making. But it says, for example, preserving the role of the Court of Justice. If reliance on EU law concepts, the Court of Justice must have a role. Well, this is something which is absolutely core to the whole point of Brexit in the first place, is whether the European Court of Justice has a role. And they're saying that preserving the integrity and functioning of the internal market, no sector by sector approach, and they've got to ensure a level playing field. Alex, it's pretty clear what the EU's position on this is. I can't get my head around just quite where they are intending, or how far they're intending to push this, or what they're trying to get Theresa May to commit to in order to move back from this a little bit. It's pretty clear that on one hand they say, well, you can't cherry pick, and on the other hand, in some areas they seem to be keen to allow the UK to cooperate. For example, Europol to cooperate. I'm just not quite sure where they're coming from with this document.
My understanding is that the judicial pillar, which came in with the Treaty of Amsterdam, was, just like the single market in the 1980s, actually a City of London and therefore British government driven, but city driving the government initiative. Neither of these was an authentic or original continental idea. It was an Anglo-American idea. And the same is true, I think, of this policing arrangement based up the road from me in The Hague. Europol, of course, has had a British head, and that seems to be a British angle or priority. The jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the European Union in Luxembourg does seem to be the complete red line for the bureaucracy. There is an increasing role for judicial decisions in keeping the show on the road, and the principle of cassation, which is breaking or overturning national courts, Supreme Court's judgments, is the real stickler here. In the Napoleonic law tradition, this is where the buck stops, is if you have control of the judiciary, and if you put sufficient state-paid activist judges in control, as has also been tried in America now with the Supreme Court nominations, That's how you have the complete control of the system. So I think the European Union is prepared to allow certain other factors, such as most of those to do with trade, internal market, and even security and policing, which have been British string pullers from the start, to drift off. But the judicial supremacy is the real red line, I think, for the continent.
If we go back a couple of years to the deal that Cameron did, where he had agreed that the EU had agreed that Britain would be entitled to opt out of certain institutions that it didn't want to be part of, there seems to be a little bit of pushback in going the other direction at the moment. And so my question really, the way I should have put it is this simply them trying to bargain, or is this a firm line in the sand for them, do you think?
For the European Union, and particularly the Eurocrats, I think this is quite serious now. That when Brexit rumblings first started, anyone under Juncker's level, I think, thought, well, if the Brits ever do get round to voting to leave, then some of them thought, well, good riddance, they've held up our project for so long. And others thought, oh, well, my salary's unaffected. It was the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, and the European Central Bank that were really annoyed. And of course, the Germans through their banking funding commitment. That's now changed, I think. The radicalization you see, especially with Martin Sellmayr, the German intelligence eminence grise at Juncker's shoulder, now taking over the running of the Juncker shop, is an indication of this. There is an absolute federalist determination. So I think that this is quite determined and serious now. The Brexit referendum, or rather the aftermath of it, the negotiations, have really catalyzed so much. There is no non-committal stance now among Eurocrats or among the Brits who are involved with the EU. You're either really for a complete exit, or you're just trying to find a way to stitch it up so that Britain remains in.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much for that. Now let's move on to Syria quickly. And an absolutely fascinating article from Robert Fisk in The Independent. I'm staggered. It's very rare that I get to say well done to any newspaper, but The Independent has published this. The headline is Western Howls of Outrage over the Ghouta siege ring hollow. We aren't likely to do anything to save civilians. How can we complain when we will not ourselves deal with the armed Islamist opposition to Assad, brackets, I'm not at this point talking about ISIS, or try to arrange our own ceasefire, even with Russian help. After all, we've been arming these people for years. And he goes on to say, here's some of the cruel facts about the siege in Ghouta. They've become buried in the real rubble and blood of the sham and apocalyptic expressions of horror from the West. He talks about comment from Sergei Lavrov, interpreted that Ghouta should be or would be destroyed by the Russians and the Syrians, interpreted by the West, that is. But he says the Russians spent many months, along with the Syrians, trying to arrange for the departure of Syrian civilians from eastern Aleppo before it was recaptured. And actually, the Russians are doing exactly the same thing now in eastern Ghouta. They are working to clear landmines and making sure that there's a corridor that's open so that people can get out if the extremists in eastern Ghouta permit them to leave. And as we saw in eastern Aleppo, that's probably not going to happen. He goes on to say, the rebels, terrorists, Islamists, armed opposition, you must pick the mantra of your choice, are of course the one other fact of the Ghouta bloodbath that must not be addressed, spoken of, mentioned, referred to, or even acknowledged. For the Nusra fighters in Ghouta, whether or not they have brought pressure on the civilians of the suburbs to stay as human shields, are part of the original Al-Qaeda movement, which committed the crimes against humanity in America in 2001, and which have, more often than not, been prepared to cooperate in Syria with ISIS, the vicious cult with which the US, the EU, NATO, and Russia, add here all other usual defenders of civilization, have promised to destroy. He says, but these armed groups are curiously absent when we express our outrage at the carnage in Ghouta. There are no Western reporters to interview them, because we, though we don't usually say so, would have our heads chopped off by those defenders of Ghouta if we tried or even dared to enter the besieged suburb. And the footage which we receive shows, incredibly, not a single armed man. This does not mean that the wounded or the dead children or the bloodied corpses, albeit with faces blurred by our thoughtful television editors, are not real, or that the film is fake. But the footage clearly does not show all of the truth. The cameras or their film editors do not depict the Al-Nusra fighters who are in Ghouta, nor are they going to. And he concludes by saying, well, maybe, yet how can we complain when we when we will not ourselves deal with the armed Islamic opposition to Assad. I'm not at this point talking about ISIS, or try to arrange our own ceasefire, even with Russian help. After all, we've been arming these people for years. We are bankrupt, bellowing our rage without the slightest hope or intention of sparing the innocent. This is a sad story of Ghouta, which I fear historians will record. Worse still, they will be right. Pretty strong words, Alex.
I'm quite delighted that Mr. Fisk has come out with this. There was never any doubting Robert Fisk's knowledge of the reason. He is one of those who, starting from the Lebanon War, has become one of the English-speaking world's profound experts on it. But in his bully pulpit in The Independent over the years, he has recently been something like an apologist for neocon ideas, not neoliberal economics. He's too left-wing for that, but certainly neocon interventionism seemed to be his thing. Perhaps he has been taking a leaf out of the book of some of the other veteran reporters, such as John Pilger and some of the Americans who have been sidelined after being grandees of journalism for telling the truth. But it's a very, very welcome development, and I wouldn't have expected it from The Independent.
Indeed. Now, spring mayhem arising in West Africa and Russia again.
Yes, Mike, earlier this week you have been reporting the 2 US vessels now in the Black Sea. This is one of the southern or western pressure points around Russia that's being ramped up this spring as we get into warfighting season, together with arguably Syria, Afghanistan, former Soviet Central Asia, all flaring up. Obviously, the Estonia and Western flank issues. North Korea, in one sense, it is a country that borders Russia near Vladivostok, so those tensions form part of this in a way. And now we see, tragically, that we've had a revival of the mid-90s style terrorism in the belt of Russian, ethnic Russian areas in the plain just north of the North Caucasus Mountains. This happened in Dagestan, which borders Chechnya, and is basically Chechnya, but with 100 minor nationalities in it. And we've had 5 people massacred as they left a Lent Orthodox service at Kizlyar Cathedral. And at the same time, we see the previously full country of Burkina Faso. Of course, that's where Thomas Sankara was assassinated in 1984-5 after giving the famous speech to the what became the African Union, talking about self-reliant development. That country is finding that its northern provinces, which border Mali, are suffering spillovers from the French intervention in Mali, and we're getting towards a 4th Malian civil war since independence, so-called, from France in 1960. The timing again is suspicious, particularly when you see African Union people saying, as guests at Munich, sort of southern clients for the African spin-off of the EU, which the African Union is. They're saying we need global responses to these things. And in the same article, Newsmax World article we just had on screen earlier on, there were admissions that the African response units in countries like Burkina Faso have had to protest that they haven't got equipment. In Mali itself, of course, the Dutch going on operations, the Dutch armed forces, have had similar problems highlighted by the Forum for Democracy, the minor party that dares to speak about these things. There does seem to be a very coordinated attempt to remove equipment in areas such as West Africa, the Sahel, and countries bordering Russia, so that there is only the chance of a global coordinated response.
Okay, and let's move on briefly to Mr. Saakashvili, because the latest news is that he has been banned from Ukraine for 3 years. This is the Ukrainian Border Service spokesman, Oleg Slobodyan, has told AFP that he's been banned on orders of the commander in charge of the border section he illegally crossed in September. Saakashvili, being typically arrogant, he's saying, with or without me, the end has already come for these authorities, and I will return to home to Ukraine very soon now, much sooner than in 3 years. And he's also posted on Facebook a response from the Border Service saying that the entry ban lasts until February the 13th, 2021. Now a stateless individual, maybe he should be in some kind of refugee camp or something.
Yes, he's one of those crossing into the European Union from its eastern frontier, like all these Chechens and others used to in the past. No, Saakashvili is remarkable. He just, he's mentally out of it. Physically, you'd expect him to be exhausted, but here we see him, the handcuffs have been slapped on, and back he goes into Poland and thereby into the European Union. we can be a bit vindicated here, Mike, because we did say, didn't we, some time ago, that he was probably going to be re-infiltrated into Poland, and from thence, who knows where he might have another commission up his sleeve to cause another Georgian revolution.
I hadn't realised, Alex, that he shares something in common with you, and he has a wife from the Netherlands. So does this give him at least some kind of right to stay in the European Union then?
Well, when he left the presidency, he had overlapping citizenships with Mrs. Roelofs, his wife, Sandra Roelofs, who's just down the road from where my wife comes from, by the way, one town beyond. But she was not willing to go back to Georgia. And so what he did was he moved the family to New York because the US was the only country where all of them had permissions to be at that time. But now he's stateless. It's very questionable where he is going to end up. He's a very mismatched man with his wife, because she's a linguist, got 6 languages fluently, and a charity grand dame, very different indeed from him. And they also have a son who will be in his teens now, called Edward. So I'm not sure what's happening with the wife and child, but it doesn't look good for them.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to fake news and the Netherlands. And we have a new Dutch channel pushing this stuff.
I was amazed to see this coming up on Facebook. Channel 6 Fake News is the name of the channel. You can see on the left there the video, the vlogs they've produced, which are unlistenable too because the audio is so bad. But you can see it's the same young lady every time. Robin is her first name. This is all public Facebook, so I haven't disclosed anything that's not publicly available. And there she is on the left. On the right, you see Channel 6 Fake News explaining itself on the About Us page, which turns out to be hosted by a charity called Stichting F6 or F6. And they're explaining at the bottom there that the reason this is needed is because 3/4, nearly 4/5 of young people no longer have any trust in traditional media. So this charity and Media College Amsterdam have formed an editorial board of 15 media students who will be researching and making news and fake news. So I thought, what's going on here? And if we go on to the next slide, we will see something about this. In the initial phase of January and February, they were going to get training from 5 entities. Bottom left, you have 2 reasonably reputable people. A5 is AT5 is an Amsterdam news channel, and the NVJ, the Dutch Union of Journalists. The other 3 leave something to be desired. From the top left, you have a young man called Nando Gauloza, who I've highlighted in red there, saying some fairly unrepeatable things to his friends on Instagram. And the boxes have moved a bit, but the next box there is supposed to, top right, is supposed to show the use of language of Ismail Ilgun, another trainer of these young people who are going to produce Channel 6 Fake News. He says he is effing happy that he's been given a second chance after having been the Netherlands' most notorious ghetto rapper until last year. He would have got the prison sentence, but he had to do an apology video. Even the Prime Minister was calling him a scumbag, and you can see on his Twitter post on the right there, he's still flipping the bird to the public. And bottom right, the 5th and final of these initial training partners to the young people on the fake news is Salto, an Amsterdam area so-called do-it-yourself news channel. And Dutch readers will see that they make 2 grammatical howlers in the first sentence about themselves, so they're not exactly reliable people, particularly when we're told to look out for typos and indication of fake news. And then finally, we go on to the next slide and we see what's gone on here. When you, Mike, on Tuesday mentioned that the Stimuleringsfonds, the promotion fund for journalism, was involved, I thought, well, that's funded by the Dutch Ministry of Education. And this fake news outlet called Channel 6 is showing on its website on the left there that it's got a lot of other government support, the Interior Ministry directly, and also a number of public lottery-funded bodies there. So I thought I would email the various bodies listed there, the charities and the government directly, the ministry, to ask what they were doing and how they were defining fake news. Was this not confusing young people and taking away their own discretion? And after that, I emailed them all. They all failed to reply within my 2 days this morning, except the one fund at the bottom there, Bijzondere Journalistieke Projecten, which replied like a shot, saying, nothing to do with us, Gov. They've used our logo in vain and taken it down now. So I took a screenshot of before and after, and the corrected version produced by Channel 6 Fake News itself shows, instead of those funders whom they don't have, they have the very same people you mentioned on Tuesday, who are a Ministry of Education funded body to promote journalism. So in several ways, this is directly Dutch government funded. What kind of people do we have? That's my final slide. We have Yes, there it is. The vlogger herself, as you can see on the right, is a semi-pro model. That's from her public Facebook. On the left, you can see a member of the governing party, the VVD, really quite delighted to be interviewed by this youth journalist. Bottom right, you can see her and the rest of her teen model resembling team posing for their shots. This is still for the prior phase in 5th of March, I believe it is. They go live on Monday the 5th of March, and then we'll see what young people's fake news they're pumping out. So it's a bottom of the barrel state-funded effort to attract young people back to the news, apparently by posing as supermodels, effing and blinding and doing ghetto rapping, unless I've misunderstood something. And why on earth are all the Dutch government and government-sponsored charity people loath to respond to UK column about their involvement and the definition of fake news they're using?
I can't imagine.
It's astonishing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think a few people in the chat box say they're smelling something about what's going on there. So I think we'll keep an eye on that. I'll just bring in a little bit of news. I don't know whether it's fake or not, but I couldn't resist this. It's a report from the dear old BBC, from the Home Deputy Editor. And I just picked up on her Twitter page that she was making bigger the front page, millions of women forced to work till they drop. And I felt forced to, put a little comment about this because this is the agenda. I wonder why this lady, Ali Hodgkin-Brown, can't actually pick up the fact the agenda is to work women till they drop.
Yes.
In the same way it's going to work men till they drop, because the aim is that we're all going to be taxed until we're exhausted and die. So I don't know whether she's working till she's going to drop in that BBC newsroom, but why can't they get it?
Well, not sure how to answer that. Anyway, let's move on to Sweden. Harbinger of globalist rule is how you've described this, Alex. And we've got a tweet from Peter Sweden here saying Sweden is literally turning into a communist police state in front of our eyes. This is scary times. If you wonder what I'm talking about, it's the new censorship law they're looking to introduce to stop journalists reporting things that would be negative for Sweden. Just what is the nature of this law then?
Well, the man on the right is describing it, Jan Sjunnesson, who is a little more measured than Mr. Peter Sweden. And he's speaking to Vlad Tepes, the Canada-based vlogger of some quality. If you go to that video, whose title I've red boxed there, Jan Sjunnesson on proposed constitutional changes in Sweden, and the timestamp that's featured there, 1140, that's the section where he's talking about this. He says that the statutes are being changed, and thereby the Swedish constitution, because the Swedish constitution is changed by statutory methods. And the idea is that if you're a Forces whistleblower or a Swedish-funded NGO whistleblower abroad, finding that Sweden in its wonderful human rights promotions is actually doing some nasty stuff, then you are going to be treated as an enemy of the state and as if you had broken national security. And this is going to be written into the Swedish constitution from now on. So it's an indication of how bang on the money the alternative media has been, particularly in Europe, I think, at UK column and continental equivalents, that we're particularly asking questions about the use of the military and the international development apparatuses of the world's biggest human rights promoters, supposedly abroad. And if you ask questions about that, you're an enemy of the state now.
Okay, and in this next one, you're saying that the Westphalian Order is falling apart in Europe?
Yeah, so on the left we have Péter Szijjártó, the Hungarian foreign minister, doing something pretty much unprecedented since 1648 in the Westphalian Order. I can understand it to some extent, but he was shooting his mouth off. He actually said that Jean Asselborn, it's in Luxembourg again, this sort of mini version of Germany in many ways. Asselborn said that Hungary was holding a very necessary migrant quota deal, and in response, Mr. Szijjártó, the Hungarian foreign minister, said my Luxembourg counterpart is a fool, or an idiot as it's been translated by Hungary News English, but the Hungarian word means both. And on the right, we see another example from the other end of Europe of the Westphalian Order of nation states respecting each other, falling apart. The CHP, the main the Republican People's Party, the main Turkish opposition, and together with a new party which calls itself the Good Party, or the Party of Good People, have both said that if they win the elections, they are going to take Greek islands by force, thereby effectively declaring war on a fellow NATO member state and fellow European country. So that is pretty unprecedented stuff. And it goes on, because we see here, if we ask who is paying the piper, for example, this Turkish new party called the Good Party, well, we have one in Britain. On the left, I've boxed that the Independent is featuring a new pro-Remain party called Renew, which immediately made me think of Renua, which is a 2015 founded party that was supposed to bring all the progressives and the centre ground together into a single Sorosite lump. It failed to gain much traction, but there we are. On the left, I'm saying that a more honest name for the new British party would have been Uncle George's Big Tent. And on the right, Uncle George's main outlet, that's Soros I'm talking about, Open Democracy UK, with his famous trademark butterfly, is one of many people. I think it's particularly interesting that the Soros outlet is doing this, saying that that the Northern Irish Unionists have got to accept an Irish Language Act in order to reopen the Stormont Assembly. Well, you'll know better than I do, Mike, but on many trips to Northern Ireland, I saw this, and as a scholar of the Irish language at Cambridge going over there was no traction at all for the use of the Irish language, even in the 90s, and when the Troubles was so supposedly resolved in the Belfast Agreement. And all of a sudden, Sinn Féin, which we see is getting a lot of Soros funds and attention, is saying there will be no reopening of Stormont until we have an Irish Language Act, which of course provides perfect opportunities for a new cadre of people to be trained in the new language schools that have to emerge, which is the same trick being pulled in Kurdistan.
Okay, and we'll end this section on this one, because the Guardian here, Netherlands becoming a narco state, warned Dutch police, and we've also got Associated Press saying Florida House, I presume that's the Florida State House of Representatives, declares pornography a health risk.
Yes, and these are, I mean, in the past, Florida would have been thought of as one of the most liberal US states. Yes, it's got some Republicans and conservative Christians and Jews, but it's a coastal state. The Netherlands, famously a very liberal state in Europe. But even there, you've got policemen and state-level legislatures now saying pornography and drugs have really rotted our countries and states from the inside out. And the Police Federation warning in the Netherlands is particularly apt that despite Dutch policemen being some of the best and most conscientious around, they are being sat upon. We see it right here in my street. If they try to get onto small-time drug dealers, and they just try to patronize the public when these things are reported, saying, well, some other Mr. Small will take his place, and he's not a Mr. Big. But as the Dutch police are now beginning to say, we're not even going after the Mr. Bigs of urban drug dealing in the Netherlands, despite the human toll being evident on every urban street in the Netherlands, because these guys then go on to start mainstream businesses, laundering businesses in tourism, hotels, and so on. And I'm afraid a lot of police and council seniors end up doing business with them at that level. So we have to ask questions, but at least something is being realized, even in the home of liberalism in both Europe and America. The bright spots of liberalism are beginning to see that it's actually eating its children.
Yes.
Well, on that happy note, I just have seen that in our chat box, somebody said 1 in 6 here on antidepressants, and we'll bring in that subject tomorrow. Having a look at BBC in particular's enthusiasm for the drug industry. But Alex, thank you very much for joining us. I think the picture that something very nasty is building in Europe. Fascinating that it's got so advanced in Sweden that you criticise your country and you're going to be put in prison. That's a real look into the future of, I think, what's coming here in UK and the European mainland, unless we stop it. End on a happy note. Thank you very much to all the people that attended the UK Column meeting at the George last night. Very good to see you all. Thank you to those that travelled distance, and of course our Cornish contingent. And a big thank you for people who've been donating to the UK Column. It is much appreciated, as are some of the chocolates, but we'll have to watch that, I think. And if you're not already a subscriber of UK Column, please take out a subscription, because we need your financial support to do what we do. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.